Ahoy there, mates. Welcome aboard the VHS pirate ship, and today we're going to be talking about Back to the Future. Now, I know what you're thinking. God, not another video about Back to the Future, and I certainly don't blame you because the YouTube is absolutely filled with them. Well, it's a popular movie, so of course there's going to be lots of videos about it, but I should say that this is not going to be just another video about Back to the Future because more specifically, we're going to be highlighting one of cinematic history's most impactful villains, Biff Tannen. And even more specifically, we're going to be highlighting the genius portrayal and performance of the character by actor Thomas F. Wilson, whose performance throughout the Back to the Future trilogy ranges far beyond just a simple high school bully. And as we find out through these three films, Biff Tannen is way more than that. And Thomas F. Wilson's performance goes way beyond just an average antagonist. Because, as you know, not only does he portray Biff Tannen, but other members of the Tannen family as well. He portrays Griff Tannen, Biff's future grandson featured in Back to the Future Part 2, and he portrays Buford Mad Dog Tannen, Biff's great-grandfather featured in Back to the Future Part 3. Through the course of these three films, he doesn't just portray Biff Tannen and some of Biff's relatives, he also portrays 5 different versions of Biff. This is phenomenally impressive and certainly shows off Thomas F. Wilson's acting chops because they're all different characters. Well, really, the 5 Biffs are all the same character, they just all have different personality traits. All of them brought on by different environmental influences, making the Biff Tannen character more complex than we ever thought. Meaning that he's not just your average 80s movie villain, and by the way, we refer to Back to the Future as an 80s movie even though it takes place primarily in the 50s. The 5 Biffs each have different personas filled with dramatic dynamics, ranging from an intimidating high school bully who obviously has no qualms against committing sexual assault or vehicular homicide, to a meek and mild beta male who clearly has some kind of brain damage. The first of the 5 Biffs is the 1955 version, as he is the most recognizable and memorable, being the antagonist of the first film and most of the second film. And this Biff is clearly the most important one because, for better or worse, he is linked to the McFly family. It would be this 1955 Biff Tannen that would prove to make or break George McFly. In the unaltered timeline, we see in the beginning of the first Back to the Future film that George McFly is a working-class schlub who basically has no confidence in himself whatsoever. And as we find out, this is because Biff Tannen basically grew up right alongside George McFly, bullying him every step of the way. And being a lifelong nemesis, we find out that not only does Biff Tannen work with George McFly, but is his supervisor. So in this original timeline, things do not work out so well for the McFly family. And this is the second Biff, the unaltered 1985 counterpart in which we see in the beginning of the first film. And this character demonstrates what happens when your high school bully grows up physically yet retains his childish mentality. He remains a bully, but is no longer physically intimidating because of his middle age. His ability to inflict physical harm has lessened, but he has become even more of an immense asshole. And this version of Biff is very much underrated because it's so forgotten about due to the fact that we only see him for a very short amount of time. But this is only from the original unaltered 1985, and as we know, through the course of the films, there would be different timelines. In the events of the first movie, we see that Marty McFly interferes with the past and therefore changes the present. Marty McFly's interference in 1955 would set off a chain of events that would lead to George McFly knocking Biff's block off. And as Marty would later explain, George had never stood up to Biff in his life. By having his clock cleaned, so to speak, Biff proves to be the catalyst to George McFly's confidence. Whether George McFly had no confidence or plenty of it, it was all because of Biff. By the simple or not so simple act of standing up to his nemesis, George McFly altered his future, giving us, the viewers, the alternate 1985 in which we see at the end of the first film, where George is a successful author and his family is all the better because of it. Now, why they would not be living in a different house, I don't know, but that's neither here nor there. And this happily ever after 1985 gives us the third Biff, who, compared to the other 2 Biffs in which we see in the first film, is a stark contrast. This Biff is a stumbling, bumbling, timid shell of a man who seems to be subservient to George McFly. This extreme personality change is more than likely due to an untreated concussion suffered from George McFly's fist of justice. Well, it may be concussive, but perhaps it's not all that conclusive. There may be more to it than just that. As we see in the events of the second film, 1955 Biff had been through a lot in a rather short amount of time. Think about it. A mysterious old man shows up and gives him a sports almanac from the future. A sports almanac in which some weird kid on a flying skateboard steals and escapes in a UFO, causing Biff to once again crash his car into a manure truck. And that car he had just gotten back from the repair shop after he had crashed it into another manure truck a few days before. And that accident was caused by sci-fi guy who looks exactly like the kid who had just stolen his future sports almanac and escaped in a UFO. And he looks exactly like him because he was him! Not to mention that in the middle of all of this, Biff gets knocked out by the biggest weenie in school. So that's a lot of trauma, a lot of mental anguish, and add a concussion on top of that, it's no wonder old Biff Tannen changed. Crashing your car into a manure truck twice is enough to give you a bit of a complex. And that certainly was the case for Biff. The whole thing made him adamant about clean cars. To the point, and as we see at the end of the first film, happily ever after 85 Biff owns his own car detailing business. That means that he hates dirty cars so much, he's dedicated his life to cleaning them. I think there's a little bit of mental disturbia within happily ever after 85 Biff Tannen. I would imagine that given all of these traumatic events, Biff would have to at least slightly remember Marty from 1955. Perhaps only subconsciously, but he would remember him to some extent. Not only would he remember him, but given what happened between the two of them in the past, he would also be a little bit afraid of him. And we see an example of this at the end of the third film.
Hey, butthead, get away! Watch it, Biff. Marty! I didn't mean to scare you. I didn't recognize you in those clothes.
What the hell are you doing?
Just putting on the second coat now. You going cowboy, huh?
This scene is very important because not only does it show that Biff is afraid of Marty, it also shows that given his snap reaction before he realizes who he's talking to, that Biff is still kind of an asshole. Just not towards the McFlys, because he's scared of its patriarch, George. Happily Ever After 1985 will continue on into Back to the Future Part 2, wherein our heroes travel to the year 2015, which back then was the future and now is almost 10 years ago. In that future, we find our fourth Biff, who is a cantankerous old man. This Biff is what the happily ever after 85 Biff becomes. Though this old man Biff really doesn't exhibit any traits that resemble the meek and mild car detailer we just saw. He's quite cranky and rather brash, but he does display some genuine concern for the McFly family in the form of disappointment. During his conversation with Marty McFly in the Cafe 80s, in which he thinks he's talking to Marty's son, Biff openly discloses his displeasure in Marty's outcome.
Huh? Think, McFly, think! Your old man, Mr. Loser. What? That's right. Loser with a capital L.
Look, I happen to know George McFly is
No,
no
I'm
longer
not
a
talking
loser.
about George McFly. I'm talking about his kid. Your old man, Marty McFly Sr., the man who took his life and flushed it completely down the toilet.
I imagine that's about as caring as a cranky old man can get. But not all is as it seems. Just because 2015 Biff is a cantankerous curmudgeon does not mean he's a harmless old man. As we know, 2015 Biff steals the time machine and takes the sports almanac back to his 1955 counterpart, making him rich and powerful within the years to come, which gives us our final and possibly most terrifying version, the alternate 85 Biff, who is more of a crime boss than a middle-aged asshole and certainly not a meek and mild car detailer. This Biff is corrupt and murderous and greedy. In fact, he'd make a perfect politician. He's powerful and rich beyond anyone's wildest dreams, which is exactly what you don't want your high school bully to become. But that is precisely what happened, and the world, or at least Hill Valley, was all the worse because of it. He buys the police off and lets crime run rampant, and the whole town becomes pretty much like a level in Double Dragon. And then we learn that he murdered George McFly and married Marty's mom. This is the worst possible outcome. Alternate 85 Biff, or Dark Biff, is by far the most intense of the 5 different personas. And Thomas F. Wilson's portrayal of this persona really made you afraid of him. And up to this point in time, you were either annoyed or mildly amused by the character. Now you see him as a real threat, because he has absolute power, yes! And absolute power corrupts absolutely. This version of Biff graduates the character from an asshole bully to an evil villain. Much like the Biff from the unaltered 85 in the beginning of the first film, middle age has lessened his physical intimidation. But with Dark Biff, it doesn't matter. He doesn't need it. He wouldn't beat you up, he would just kill you, and he would get away with it. This is when the film series veers off the road and stops being a comedic sci-fi adventure and becomes a serious crime drama. And this is one of the few times where you're actually worried for Marty's safety. To invoke such a reaction from the audience is a credit to Thomas F. Wilson's ability. The only other times when you fear for Marty's life is in the first film with the Libyan nationalists, and in the third film with his encounters with Mad Dog Tannen. And that character is tremendous tremendously threatening because not only do we see him hang Marty, but shoot him as well. Mad Dog Tannen is another stunning and terrifying performance by Thomas F. Wilson. He's totally convincing as this character. He's not just a bully, he's a killer. This character does raise some pretty interesting questions. He's Biff's great-grandfather, and since the family name has obviously been perpetuated, that means that Mad Dog was married. Though his age is never mentioned, when we see him in Back to the Future Part 3, we can probably assume that he's in his 20s, and therefore has yet to marry. He's plenty busy being a Wild West outlaw. We know that since Biff exists, Mad Dog would eventually settle down and have a crop of kids. And it is a little strange to think that this guy would eventually be married. Obviously, that happens, or does it? Clearly, in the original timeline, it does happen, but what about the altered timeline? In Back to the Future Part 3, the events that take place in 1885 would have disrupted the future. The event that would have had the most effect on the future would be Mad Dog's final showdown with Marty. It would have changed the course of the Tannen family. Mad Dog was waylaid by this encounter, leading to his capture and arrest for robbing the Pine City stage, which is an offense that back then would have more than likely warranted a death sentence. If not the death sentence, if you add in Mad Dog's extensive previous record, he's at least going to jail for a very long time, which wouldn't leave much of an opportunity to get married, would it? We can only assume, and I think safely so, that Mad Dog would have never gotten caught if it hadn't been for Marty. Because of Marty's interference with the timeline, Mad Dog gets arrested, and the Tannen family ends there, which means that Biff wouldn't exist. He never would have existed, but clearly he still does. Since we see the happily ever after 85 Biff Tannen at the end of Back to the Future Part 3, something must have happened to allow the Tannen family to continue. Maybe Mad Dog escaped jail, but if he did that, you would think he would have changed his name to avoid detection. Well, perhaps he did. We wouldn't know. We see that it's Biff, but we don't know if his last name is still Tannen. Maybe Mad Dog had a brother, and the events that disrupted the timeline would have made him be Biff's great-grandfather. Maybe this said brother and different great-grandfather was a lot friendlier than Mad Dog was, resulting in a completely different disposition throughout the Tannen family. And the Biff we see in Happily Ever After 85 is the real Biff all along, meaning that by the end of the first movie, the events in Back to the Future Part 3 had already happened. Which means that Happily Ever After 85 Biff would be nice because that's how he always has been. And he now lives in fear of George McFly because George McFly was the bully all along. Far-fetched? Maybe. But when you have movies about time travel, there's a lot to work with. Let's go back to 2015 Biff for a second. Now, maybe I'm being a little too picky here, but isn't it weird that he knows how to operate the time machine? Seems like that would be pretty complex. I mean, he had no instruction whatsoever. How did he know how to do that? Stealing a car is one thing, but a time machine seems like it would be a little bit different. So he steals a time machine to make himself rich in the past, which is something that if this were Time Cop, he'd be arrested for. Speaking of car theft, which is what he totally did, you can add Grand Theft Auto to his list of crimes. A list that includes 2 counts of sexual assault, 1 count of attempted rape, 1 count of reckless endangerment, and 2 counts of attempted vehicular homicide.
Yeah, Biff, what a character.
In closing, the characters of Biff Tannen, Mad Dog Tannen, and the 5 Biffs were splendidly performed. The Back to the Future trilogy proves to me that Thomas F. Wilson as an actor is right up there with Gary Oldman and Daniel Day-Lewis. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to hit subscribe and share this stuff. I really could use all the help I could get. And please consider supporting me on Patreon by joining the Skeleton Crew. The link will be in the description. Take care out there, and I'll see you next time, only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.